Washington Journal continues.
Congressman Matt Gaetz is with us. He represents Florida's 1st District, including Pensacola and Fort Walton Beach. Joining us this morning, the day after the protests on Capitol Hill, and also a first step in the U.S. House in passing a school safety measure. We spent the first hour of the program talking with our viewers and their reaction to the protests, both here and across the country. What was your takeaway from what you saw in Washington and what you were hearing from your constituents in your district?
Well, as a Floridian, this is something that hits home for us. We had no smiles in the Sunshine State after this terrible tragedy at Parkland, and I know my fellow Floridians would like to see action to ensure that our schools are safe and that no parent has to drop a child off and then the next day clean their room out because they're not around anymore. So I'm proud of the work of the House yesterday to dedicate funding for school hardening, school safety. Some of that money can be used for metal detectors, school resource officers, enhanced ID scan technology so that we know who's on campus and who's there to contribute to the educational mission and who might be there to do mischief. I also have to say, maybe I have a different view than some of my colleagues, but I think that protest is the sign of a vibrant and healthy democracy. And the fact that students around the country shared their views, even if they might not be views that I hold or that others hold, I think that that's a good thing for civic engagement, and particularly for a young generation that will ultimately be responsible for governing, to see that the decisions that are made impact quality of life, I think is good connectivity to have in the country.
Well, you're a graduate of Florida Tech, Florida State,
yes.
Florida State,
yes.
and William and Mary Law School. But you're one of the youngest members of Congress. Did you see some of that passion of those folks yesterday on Capitol Hill? Does that feel familiar to you? You're not that many years from being in high school.
That's right, and I have to tell you, Bill, as a consequence of the Pennsylvania special election, I'll move from the 3rd youngest member of Congress to the 4th youngest member of Congress. So I'm off the medal stage when it comes to youth in the institution, thanks to Connor Lamb. But I'll certainly say that I do hope for a day when the millennial generation is civically engaged in a productive way. And I do think that protest can be a spark that ignites in someone that civic engagement. And so again, whether it's protesting for things I agree with or disagree with, I do think that it is a healthy sign for democracy.
Well, obviously the Parkland shooting, the Douglas High School shooting, was the spark to this current protest and next Saturdays as well. But it also made your legislature there in Florida act fairly quickly on gun legislation. The governor signing in legislation that raised the age limit from 18 to 21. Do you think that there's anything that the House, the U.S. House, can learn from the way that Florida approached their legislative effort after the shooting?
We absolutely can learn from the mental health provisions in that legislation. I'm not a supporter of national gun control. In addition to my Second Amendment concerns, I would have substantial 10th Amendment concerns. I think that those are issues best left to the states to experiment with, and then hopefully best practices for school safety will rise to the top and be modeled. In Florida, there was less, I think, discussed reform that occurred, but I think far more significant. All across the country, we have a patchwork of mental health laws that frequently don't take advantage of the opportunities you have to screen people for their behavior and then to ultimately make a determination regarding the risk that they pose to themselves or others. Florida took a huge step forward in enhancing the capabilities of state government to engage in those screenings, and I think that'll help us find these red flag cases. At the national level, I was very disappointed when we just had a discussion with the FBI that the FBI didn't seem to have a full grasp of their capabilities when it came to scanning social media, using artificial intelligence and machine learning to have the most high impact, high acuity cases rise to the top. I mean, in this case, Bill, we had a lady on January 5th call the FBI and say that this Parkland shooter was training for a school shooting in his backyard, that he was obsessed with ISIS, and yet we didn't have the investigative work because there was too high a volume of information.
The Senate Judiciary Committee held a hearing yesterday on school safety, gun violence. They heard from one of the acting deputy directors in the FBI, as well as other law enforcement officials. You're on the Judiciary Committee in the House. Any plans for your committee to take up this issue?
Well, I think that the full House really took up the position that we hold on school safety, which is an investment of resources into the capabilities that can stop a school shooter in the future. I do not expect gun control to be passed out of the House Judiciary Committee. We did pass legislation well before the Senate to revise the NICS process so that we can label people who would be a specific threat to themselves or others and then ensure that they don't have access to firearms. But I think the good in that is that we isolate gun control on people who actually would do harm rather than wide-scale gun control that could deprive totally law-abiding people of their constitutional rights.
And on that background, Val, this is the fixed NICS now that's in the Senate.
Correct.
And the House version came out last year with a provision in there regarding concealed carry across the country.
Yeah, reciprocity, sure.
Do you think that if that bill winds up passing the Senate coming back without that measure, that it could survive in the House?
I doubt that. I think the House is very serious about our concealed carry reciprocity legislation. We don't believe that someone's Second Amendment rights should stop at the state line, and we think it's critically important to be able to include that in any gun reform that we do. My hope is that the Senate would see that concealed carry reciprocity doesn't make anyone less safe. In my state of Florida, concealed carry permit holders are 8 times less likely to commit a crime than members of law enforcement. So these are some of our most law-abiding people, and we would want to extend them every opportunity to realize their rights under the Second Amendment.
Our guest is Congressman Matt Gaetz of Florida, here to talk about school safety and gun violence, but other issues the House and Congress in general is facing. Here's how to be part of the conversation. Democrats use 202-748-8000, Republicans 202-748-8001. All others 202-748-8002. We'll welcome your tweets as well at C-SPAN WJ. Before we get to calls, though, I wanted to play you some comments from yesterday's debate on the school safety bill led off by the member from New York on the Judiciary Committee, Gerald Nadler. Although that bill passed by a big margin, I think it was 407 to something, Democrats certainly wanted other things attached. Let's take a listen to what he had to say. I want to get your reaction.
This bill does not include any provisions to strengthen our gun laws or to help keep guns out of the hands of those who should not possess them. Evidence and experience tell us that we must establish universal background checks instead of the flawed system we now have. We should encourage states to adopt laws providing for extreme risk protection orders, and we must ban assault weapons and high-capacity ammunition magazines. These steps would help prevent not only school shootings, but would reduce the daily toll of gun violence in our communities.
Several things from Jerry Nadler there that obviously weren't part of the debate, certainly not part of the bill yesterday. Your thoughts?
Well, the House did take previous action on the fixed NICS legislation, which you mentioned. And so some of what Mr. Nadler mentioned is true in terms of timing, but not in terms of the substance of what the House has taken up and passed. I've also spoken to Donald Trump about the bump stock issue, which Mr. Nadler referenced, and I have every expectation that ATF will be taking action administratively to enforce existing law so that you don't have people jerry-rigging firearms to be able to have the enhanced capability for widespread violence.
How often do you get a chance to speak to the president?
I get a chance to speak to him occasionally. I would say he's been pretty busy lately, so I haven't talked to him in a couple weeks.
If you call him, will he take your call?
It's usually the president that calls me. I don't dial up the White House. He'll usually give me a ring.
Let's hear first from Ben, who's in Purcellville, Virginia, Republican line, for Matt Gaetz. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, C-SPAN, and thank you, Congressman, for your service.
Thank you.
I am a federal emergency manager, and I'm an expert in active shooter response, and I wanted to address an issue that has not received a lot of coverage. I haven't seen very much discussion of it at all, and that is what we're still teaching kids regarding what to do in schools for active shooter response. I watched all of the coverage of Parkland, and unfortunately, I've studied every school shooting since before that. And what I can tell you is the majority of our schools in this country are still following what's called lockdown procedures. And there's an institutional resistance throughout the educational community to change from that. Unfortunately, those of us who study this subject have determined pretty much scientifically that lockdown isn't just not the best solution. It's just about the worst thing you can do. In fact, no plan at all would probably be better than lockdown. There are much better ways to do this. And I think we need to bring more attention to that, because right now what we're doing is we're making kids in schools into targets. Yes, we should work to try to prevent these shootings from happening, but in the interim, the fact is they do happen, and we need to do better for the kids in the schools. Also, if I may offer one suggestion, on the conversation regarding weapons permits and things like that for teachers. We have an existing program that's a perfect model for how to address that subject, and that's the Federal Armed Flight Deck Officer Program that was created in the aftermath of 9/11 to allow pilots to bring weapons into the cockpit. It establishes strict criteria, strict training requirements. It's federally managed. It's a volunteer program. And I think something like that could be looked at as a model for allowing those teachers who want to obtain the training and certification and skills necessary to be allowed to carry a firearm in the schools. But it's not.
Appreciate your input, Ben.
Yeah, I completely agree with Ben's assessment regarding the need to update and modernize the mechanisms of our response. The resources that the House approved yesterday can be used to bring people in to create those updates and to assist districts with that technical knowledge. But I would also suggest to Ben that he reach out to our office or any other to help us get connected with the Department of Education. Betsy DeVos is looking at a wide-scale program for response that would include not only some of the physical assets, but the training assets to ensure that in an active shooter situation, we've got an appropriate response. Ben also raised the issue of arming school personnel, and I do know that in the state of Florida, the legislation you referenced includes provisions that sets a very high standard for training, but that allows some select school personnel to function as a force multiplier to our uniformed law enforcement.
And all of that is voluntary. In other
Correct.
words, now, is there any consideration if you're taking on that responsibility, that role, is that person paid more? Is that person?
That would be up to the school district. It would not be a teacher. In Florida, they made the decision to not mix the pedagogy mission with the security mission, but there are other school personnel, administration, athletics coaches, deans that would be eligible to receive that extra training if they volunteered to assist in the school safety protocols.
Let's move on to Salisbury, North Carolina, and LC on our Democrats line.
Yes, Matt, my name is LC Brader. I'm a licensed concealed carry. If a man with an AR-15 start firing it, I'm not pulling my little Pete gun out and try to shoot him. Now, why is it that all of these killings, mass shootings, are done by white boys, and they are deemed crazy? But if it was a Muslim, you'd pass a law tomorrow. If y'all been killing people ever since you got here. You kill off all the Indians, and then you've been shooting each other. Mass shootings done by whites, but y'all deem them as mental something wrong with them. We're not the only one got people crazy around the world, but that's the only place this killing is done. And ain't nobody facing down, nobody with an AR-15 that's firing shots like that. Not with, I got a 45, and if I don't get hit the first time, I'm not looking to shoot back at him. And him 100 yards away and can kill people. That little 45 ain't worth a hill of beans.
All right, LC.
Well, thank you for the question. I would suggest that even if you're outgunned, that's better than being unarmed. And in circumstances, I remember talking with my colleagues who came under fire at baseball practice, and several of them said to me, some had served in combat, that if they'd had access to a firearm when they got back to the dugout, it would have at least been a fight. Because had Mr. Scalise not been at baseball practice with his security, I would have been burying a number of my colleagues as a consequence of that tragic event. And so I think that it helps focus the mind for members of Congress that we were in a circumstance with our own colleagues in a situation like that. As to the question of whether or not we evaluate the cause for mass shootings differently with different races, I would say that the Pulse nightclub shooting in my state was a state that had very different motivations than the shooting that we saw at Sandy Hook or at Marjory Stoneman Douglas. And there was not, I think, a difference in the mechanism of response. It's taken us some time to understand what would be an effective strategy to deal with these mass shootings, and it's my hope that broader mental health management and better diagnostics for this type of behavior with a scanning of social media would help us identify these circumstances earlier and take more appropriate action.
Do you think that, going back to Jerry Nadler's comments about keeping the guns out of the hands of people like the suspect in the Parkland shooting, the Pulse nightclub shooting, that there are other methods of beyond just mental health that you can identify and prevent people from getting those guns in the first place?
Yes, I think that enhancing our database assets would not only would help us on the mental health front, but to ensure that people who are domestic abusers, people who've committed felonies that wouldn't be eligible for guns, actually don't receive them. You'll recall that the Las Vegas shooter never should have had access to a firearm, but as a consequence of poor sharing of information and poor reporting, he was able to have that access. And so I think that we can do a lot with the use of technology to create interoperability among the different data sets that we use to make these decisions.
Let's go to Tulsa, Oklahoma. Frank, good morning on the Independent line.
Well, my name is Willie. I'd like to make a comment.
Frank, make sure that you turn down your television. Go ahead with your comment.
Okay, I sure will, sir.
Okay, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Willie, and I'm calling. I'm looking at this guy on TV. I was in Vietnam twice, wounded, in 1966. I wanted this guy really ever face down any kind of type of weapon at all, period. I see him on TV. I get totally sick. He's a coward. Thank you.
Let's, I had the wrong line punched out. I'll go to Frank in Tulsa. Sorry about that, Frank. You are now on the line. Tulsa, go ahead.
All right. Thank you. I'm a disabled Vietnam combat veteran, and what I've observed is after I got home from Vietnam, they made it legal to kill unborn babies, and they'd already kicked God out of school, no praying. I don't know if they still say the Pledge of Allegiance or not, but they're teaching these kids that they came from monkeys and whatever they want to do socially, sexually, or anything else is just fine. They let them play these games that are used to train combat people nowadays, and they start killing each other and everything. So we want to make laws. The basics are their beautiful little brains when they first start school. That's where they ought to be introduced to God and love for their fellow man.
All right, Frank, Congressman Gaetz.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely right that any politician or any lawmaker that says that by the fiat of one law we can solve all of the societal problems that lead to violence, I think that represents a lack of humility into what our capabilities are in government. And it's certainly true that as our care for one another in society degrades, it increases the likelihood that you have these acts of mass violence. And so I don't have the answer. I don't know what the silver bullet is, but I think that the caller's correct to identify that there's really a wide array of inputs into young minds that can lead them in the good direction or a bad direction.
We noticed in the Northwest Florida Daily News a guest column there from a young man named Patrick Wallace, excuse me. He says he's currently studying computer engineering at the University of Central Florida, and he writes a guest column in the form of a letter to you saying that, in part, saying, thoughts and prayers are welcome and encouraged, but Representative Gaetz, this needs to stop. I don't feel safe anymore in the state I call home at my university in the United States. Wherever I go places, I have to take into account what if someone started shooting? What is the fastest escape? One of your constituents, what's your sort of response to that?
Well, you know, no one can pass a law that says by virtue of law there will be no more violence and there will be no more shooting. We have to create laws that establish conditions that make those events less likely. And I think that the endeavors that we're undertaking to strengthen our database assets, to better use technology to find these red flag cases, and then to ensure that we've got the right mental health structure in place when we have those folks so that we do something to improve their condition is the best thing we can do. I don't think that wide-scale deprivations of people's gun rights is the appropriate response. One, I don't think it will work because I think the bad guys will still get guns. And second, I don't think that that would withstand a constitutional review.
Let's hear from Susan in Goodyear, Arizona on the Republican line. Hi, Susan.
Good morning. Good morning. Oh, I've been dying to get on C-SPAN to talk
Me too,
about
Susan.
the Republican. I have two questions and then a statement, if you don't mind. Please let me say this. I live in Goodyear Desert School. My kids went there, and they're 25, 26 now. They own guns because their dad trained them with the guns for safety. They have a safety hazard. They have a case at home. They have everything. Because one of our family members got raped and jumped out of an apartment. So the two younger girls got trained. They went shooting, hunting. They were trained. It starts with the home. Same thing with mental. Same thing with drugs. I have an alcoholic son. He just got out of prison. And we're here as parents, even though he's older, we're training him. We're keeping his mind out of jail and going back into jail to learn how to survive out here. Oh, you know what? I'm so proud of you. I'm so proud of the Republicans. I'm so proud of Donald Trump, our president, from the day he walked down that wall. He's trying to do drugs, help the kids here with the drugs. He's trying to get the wall up. He's trying to do the next step is the guns. What happened with Chicago? All those kids out there on the field in the Capitol did not talk about Chicago at all.
All right, Susan, we'll hear from Congressman Gaetz.
I agree that people need to be well equipped when handling firearms. They need to be well trained. That's one of the reasons why in the state of Florida, the school marshal program had very high standards for training. To get a concealed carry permit, we discussed that issue earlier. States have established very high training standards for that. And I think that it's appropriate to always be evaluating how we can ensure that we have responsible gun ownership in this country. And we all play a part in that. And I think that the caller correctly pointed out it's not always just the government that has to assume that responsibility. Within a family, promoting the values and goals of responsible gun ownership can do a lot to not only stop mass shootings, but accidents that take lives as well.
You mentioned your concern over the FBI not reading the signs ahead of the Parkland shooting. You've also been critical of the FBI on the Clinton investigation, the independent Mueller probe, actually you calling late last year, early this year for a second special counsel. And I want to get your reaction to a story this morning about what the Attorney General is considering possibly firing the Mr. McCabe, reporting the former acting FBI director, just days before the Bureau's second-ranking highest official is set to retire. Mr. McCabe is the focus of an internal Justice Department probe on the FBI's investigative decisions during the 2016 campaign, including the probe of former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's use of private email server. The Justice Inspector General concluded that Mr. McCabe was not forthcoming during the review reported by the New York Times, which first broke the story, a decision that Jeff Sessions has to make. What's your take on this?
Well, Jeff Sessions has more information than I do, but I certainly think there's sufficient information to terminate Mr. McCabe. In particular, Mr. McCabe had a role in sending emails to the Washington field office during the Hillary Clinton email investigation, telling them to stop investigating, depriving them of their jurisdictional responsibility to work that case, and instead removing that case to the headquarters, where then the drafts of statements describing the conduct of Ms. Clinton were changed so that they would not carry with them criminal culpability, but would instead carry a different tint. And so I would agree with that. I believe that the timing of that decision is likely linked to the release of the Inspector General's report on the activities at the FBI. Michael Horowitz is the Inspector General, and we expect his report very soon now, and we've heard that it will be very critical of some of the political activity of Mr. McCabe and the extent to which that metastasized over to his professional duties.
When that report actually comes out, how does that come to you? Is that you're on the Judiciary Committee, do you get a first look at it? You're out of session on Friday, heading back to the district for the weekend or whatever. How do you actually get a chance to see that report?
Well, typically the chairman, Bob Goodlatte, will get a briefing of the report. There may be some provisions that we have to review in a secure facility.
Sure.
There may be other provisions that we can have in open hearing. So likely the chairman will make the decision about how to proceed with publicizing that report based on its contents and to what extent any disclosure of sources and methods would need to be redacted.
Let's get a few more calls here and hear next from Herbert, Fort Washington, Maryland, on our Democrats line. Good morning, Fort Washington. You're on the air.
Good morning. Yeah, I would like to ask that man, who's running the country, the NRA or the Republicans or the Democrats? Because like the Democrats and the Republican Party is not doing anything, and you guys just keep passing the buck. You know what I mean? I'm from South Carolina. I grew up with Martin Luther King March and everything and protested. That's the only way we got something done. And you guys on all the 15 rifles, y'all on them, The black people don't know y'all killing your own people. Why you keep killing your own people? So y'all ain't hurting us, you're hurting your own self. Won't you do something about it and stop the nonsense? You know what, just get rid of the NRA and all that stuff will be over with. Thank you. Bye.
Congressman Gaetz, address the influence, your perceived your perception of the influence of the NRA, both on a personal or campaign level and more broadly with the rest of your colleagues.
The NRA has substantial influence because they speak for a substantial number of Americans who share the goals and values of the NRA and who enjoy their Second Amendment rights to the fullest extent. I would point out to the caller that there have been issues where the president has pushed back on the NRA, particularly on the issue of bump stocks. The president has come out and said, we're going to do something about this. And there have been other areas where Republicans have agreed or disagreed with views held by the NRA, much like any other group in this town that represents people who hold a particular viewpoint on an issue.
On that issue on bump stocks, we've heard the president say, well, I'm going to do something about that. Legislatively, how does that have to be handled? Is that something he can mandate by an executive order? Or
yeah, we believe that current law gives ATF the ability to stop bump stocks from being able to be used by people, particularly purchase and sale. We think that we've got to become a little more effective at ensuring that that law is enforced and followed, and I think that the use of technology will help us in that endeavor.
Let's hear from Sebring, Florida, Republican line. Terry, hello there.
Hey, good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
I'm very happy to speak. I'm so excited to speak to Matt Gaetz because he's a very good congressman. He is focused, experienced, and he has passion about everything he does. And thank you very much about that. On the other gun issue, I'm a single mother. I have a daughter that's 22. At 13, she was in middle school and she was bullied like nobody could imagine. I taught my daughter a couple of things. Number one, how to change a tire. Number two, we got her into shooting a gun, know how to shoot a gun and protect herself. She's a concealed carry right now. She's 22. She has a little girl of her own. And number three, she's kind and smart.
Well, thank you. It sounds like you have every reason to be very proud of your daughter, and thank you for the kind words. And I think the caller's points highlight the importance of responsible gun ownership and training. And I think that is a viewpoint held by many Floridians. We've got nearly 2 million Floridians who are concealed carry permit holders, just like the daughter that was referenced in the last call.
A bill that passed in the House yesterday by a fairly large margin, this Stop School Violence Act would provide funds for training to spot and report warning signs of potential gun violence. It would create a coordinated reporting system. It would implement school threat assessment protocols and boost school efforts to develop violence prevention programs. It authorizes $50 million annually over 10 years. Any chance, or what do you know of the Senate taking up that legislation?
We have every expectation and hope that the Senate will take this up. This is very bipartisan. I think that in Washington too often we start with the issues we disagree on rather than beginning with common ground, and there is a lot of common ground on the theory that we can do so much more, as several of our callers have mentioned, to improve the quality of the response that we have, not only to red flag cases like the Parkland shooter, but also in the event of an active shooter, what can we do to save the maximum amount of lives?
Let's get one more call. Bob's in Baldwinville, Massachusetts. Independent line.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I would like to say to everybody out there in America that an automatic weapon, an M16, fires over 800 rounds a minute. Now, everybody's screaming that you want to take these weapons off the market. They're not automatic weapons. You can't fire 800 rounds a minute with a bump stock. Okay? I mean, that is an automatic weapon. The other thing I'd like to say is when Nancy Pelosi and Mr. Schumer start coming up at people's driveways, what is an acceptable amount of American deaths trying to take away the firearms of the people in this country? Because they're not going to give them up. Have a nice day. Thank you.
Well, I think the caller is well apprised as to what the capabilities are of different firearms. I would suggest that the meaning of the Second Amendment maybe is worthy of discussion. I mean, the Second Amendment doesn't exist for hunting. It doesn't exist for self-defense. The Second Amendment exists so that people can maintain an armed rebellion against their government. And we could debate or disagree about whether or not we should have a Second Amendment, but I think that when you isolate the purpose, it would tend to lead us away from the types of reforms that would limit the capabilities of the firearm itself. And so I think that goes to the caller's point.
Last issue, and we'll let you go in a moment. I want to get your reaction to a headline, a story about potential deal on Dreamers, according to the Washington Post. White House officials have told Republican leaders, key leaders, that President Trump is open to cutting a deal in an upcoming spending bill to protect young immigrants from deportation in exchange for border wall funding, according to 4 GOP officials. This is the bill that has to be passed by next week. What do you know of this?
Well, I'm proud of the president. Everything from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act he was able to negotiate to his willingness to engage with Democrats on immigration. And the president wants a deal on immigration. I'm certain of this. He wants to do right by Dreamers, but he also wants border security. So if we can get the right mix of issues with wall funding, with border security, I would hope E-Verify, then I think we could build in a solution that is acceptable to the country for Dreamers, and we can move forward with an immigration strategy that puts America first. And with a growing economy from tax cuts, if we get immigration right, I really believe that the economic potential of this country is ready to take off.
Congressman Matt Gaetz, 1st District of Florida, Republican from that state. Thanks for being with us this morning. We'll look for you on the House floor a bit later this morning.
Thank you, Bill.